Yeah, that's good tea. My friends, Francisco Ricardo. I've been following some pretty amazing research. Some people have been doing some pretty interesting things that have to do with, now tell me if you don't think this is interesting, bending or affecting the linearity of time. Think what you may, I think it's fair to say that most of us would think that time only rolls in one direction and there isn't much you can do to objectively change anything that happens in a temporal sequence. You can't make an hour go any slower. You can't go back in time. We all already know this. And yet, there's a thing about time that seems to be very involved with cause and effect, that things in going forward set up conditions for certain results and outcomes. And it would seem to be the case that the best life that you could live and the best directions that you could and decisions that you could make have to do with being informed ahead of time so that you can anticipate the result. There was when I was in graduate school, there was a guy, Ron Slaby, amazing professor. And this guy was devoted his entire life at Harvard to try to there were several people who did this, create research on how kids who were potentially at risk, as well as other adults who were at risk for violence, could prevent violence. So he worked with convicts in prisons and stuff like that. And Ron said something that was really interesting. He said, if I could summarize a lot of what I'd already done, a lot of my research, it would be like this. I would say to people, when you're walking down the street, it comes down to this. This is the metaphor to be aware of. When you're walking down the street, you are on one side of the sidewalk, right? One side of the street, and you're on the sidewalk. And now, at the end of that street, there are some hoods, some thugs, some people who are kind of bad news bearers. They're bad vibes people. And you don't want to have anything to do with those people. So at some point, you're going to have to make a decision to either walk past them, which is really essentially inviting trouble, or you're going to cross the street, right? But it makes a world of difference, he said, to cross the street 10 feet before you see them than it does to see that trouble all the way ahead of the block and then cross the street now. And if it looks really bad, maybe you don't even go down that street, you try a different street. The idea is that there's a way in which your ability to anticipate outcomes determines more in your life than we normally give things credit for. And this ability to reason in anticipation stands in rather direct contrast with the impulse that a lot of people have to sort of play it by ear, right? They're basically saying, hey man, I don't want to have things too pre-planned. I want to go out there and I want to see what happens in the moment. Live the moment. Well, you can live the moment, but there are elements of things that actually do really well when you improvise and you wait for the magic of that moment to emerge. And then there are things that you really have to anticipate with great planning if you're going to have the kind of outcome that you want. And logic dictates, and good upbringing also dictates, a lot of educated people, etc., they're taught that in order for you to get what you want out of life, you need to plan ahead. And the bigger the consequence for the end result that you want, the longer it takes to plan. So if you want to have a certain kind of career, or you want to build a certain kind of family, or you want to, have some sort of success, have a certain kind of house, etc., You have to save ahead of time. You have to do these planning kinds of activities that show that you are putting one foot in front of the other, and that's because these things take time to do, to build, to realize, right? So I'm only saying the most obvious things, but the point is that a lot of the people who I've known who are kind of spur of the moment types of improvisatory types of people are fascinating. They're interesting people. I love being around them. Interesting energy, charismatic, very spontaneous. But it's often the case that they don't really have more than what that moment brings them. And maybe that's all that life is going to give you, just that very moment. But from day to day, it does make a difference the kind of life you have, the kind of choices you have, the kind of house you live in. I don't mean to be materialistic, but you have qualitative differences, and you can make choices according to what you want. It shouldn't be the case that we should all be denigrating or negatively judging, dismissing, or critiquing certain choices just because they took longer to realize or to build a foundation of preparatory conditions for them. I mean, that's not something that I hold against anyone. You can perhaps agree with me on this. But part of the research that I've been running into, which is very interesting, is research carried out by several people originally at a lab in Princeton, New Jersey. And this lab did a lot of psychic sort of research on anomalous and hard to quantify effects of mind projected out onto something that there was no other connection to. There was no touching, there was no button pressing, no pressing of a bar, no making any sound, nothing. But actually using mind as an input to affect a device that had no other connection to the body. Okay? So we know at this time of no method by which at a distance a person by thinking can affect the outcome of anything. We don't have a method for doing this in electronics, right? Like you can convince a human being, the person could listen to you, you can convince them, you can change their mind. But we don't have an electronic device by which then, right, at a distance, you're thinking of something, you can change the results or somehow affect the behavior or the output of that device. We don't have that. And because we don't have that, it's fair to say that when we operate as human beings in our given aura, our space, our circle, or our field of energy, while that can be measured, we can measure you can measure the thermal energy coming out of a body, you can measure a lot of things. There's no way in which we seem to have a mechanism by which we can direct that energy toward something and cause it to perform selectively according to our wishes. However, and so the best way to really test whether such an effect can be generated by thought alone is not actually to have something that has a switch that's on or off like a television set. You're like sitting there thinking and see if that TV will turn on based on your ability to really focus and concentrate on it, and you put your intention on it. Rather, the better method is to, there's nothing wrong with that, but I think that is much too narrow a way to test whether there is in fact something like the ability of people to project their psychic or other energy onto devices and instrumentation. So the better way to set up an experiment, it is generally accepted, is to have a device that would be a random number generator. So this device will be generating random numbers now. There's a lot of conversation in mathematics and computer science circles around how to generate a truly random number. I mean, when you start thinking about it, how do you know that the number is random, right? And if you have a piece of software, you have to be able to somehow read something in a selectively systematic way, but what it's producing from that selectively systematic process has to be anything but selectively systematic. It has to be random. It's the opposite of that. So how do you get from something that has a sequence of pre-programmed steps out to something that is completely like just random? And so there's a lot of interesting theories about how to do this, and there's a lot of implementations. But one of the implementations for generating a random number in electronic instrumentation is to do a kind of deep dive into some electrical or photon or matter-specific electronic kind of signal, and select something from that signal, knowing full well that that signal is constantly fluctuating in some way that is not regular. You could do this with a lot of things, but for example, another way to do it would be to have a recording of nature, right? And have several recordings of nature, and then have or any kind of recording, let's say, and then have those recordings overlaid on top of each other, starting at moments that are uniquely different each time, and they're overlaid on top of each other, right? One way you could do this randomly, for example, is to take every next number of an infinite sequence, like for example pi, 3.1415926, etc., and so on. And so at every next number that you have, you basically begin playing back this audio with whatever number you had as a kind of interval of waiting. So if the number is 1, you play the sequence, you stop for 1 second and play the sequence again. The next number might be 7, you stop 7 seconds and you play it again, right? The idea is if you have a number of audio, for example, files, could be 4, could be 20, and each is starting right again and again and again with a series of interval waiting periods that is not determined to be a regular number, then you can have these audio sounds overlaid on each other, and then you can measure, for example, the audio level to decibel level, etc. And when it reaches a certain decibel level, some random number, then breaking over a threshold, then you generate, say, a 0 or a 1, and then everything else is 0. And so what's happening is that these sounds are going through a fluctuation of volume, of intensity, then you're using a threshold number to determine whether a machine should put out a 0 or a 1, and that's relatively random. So in that case, you can approach that. But here's what started happening. In this laboratory called the Pear Lab, it ran for 30 years at Princeton. The attempt was to see if in a completely enclosed room with no other external inputs, to see if a subject could affect the outcome, in fact could predict the outcome of a random number in a sequence. And the easiest way to set up that particular experiment is to tell, let's say you want to do this as an experiment. You have to set up two groups, right? One would be the so-called experimental group, and then one would be the control group. Now, if you don't know how the experimental model works, it's very simple. You pick two groups of people who are in some way indistinguishable from each other. So in order to, let's say you have a group of 10 and another group of 10, it should be the same number, okay? Could be 100 and 100, doesn't matter. But don't make it 2 and then 50, right? Each group should be approximately the same number of participant subjects. And to each group, you ask or you provide them with a rather similar input, or you condition them slightly differently. One group, you tell them, that's the control group, you tell them, you are going to see this, or you're going to be able to do this, etc. And you program them to expect that they'll either be able to see or experience or write or perform something that's what you want them to do. And then that's the experimental group. And then the control group, you do the exact same thing, but you do the opposite. You tell them the opposite. So for example, and this doesn't have to be inside of experimental conditions. For example, there was a study, an education study, that was published under the title Pygmalion in the Classroom, in which it happened, this is crazy, it happened that at the beginning of an academic year, a teacher on certain instructions informed the students in her incoming class, and this is in grammar school, I think it was grammar school, I don't think it was high school. She told them that, which was not true, she told them that they were a specially selected group and they were above average and they were an excellent group, and that therefore they were going to be given harder examples and harder tests, and it was expected that they were going to, because of their increased intelligence over other classes, score better grades. Okay, that's your experimental group. And then as a control group at the same year in another class, the second teacher of her own classroom told the students exactly the opposite. She told them that they were kind of a special group. They were kind of flunkies. Nobody wanted to, deal with them. They were a special group, and that they weren't expected to perform very well. So some of them would even be flunking and failing. You can wonder about some of the ethical dimensions of setting up a test like this, but that's exactly what happened. At the end of the academic year, everyone performed to expectations. The very average students who had been told that they were excellent students turned out to have actually performed like actual A+ students, did excellent work, and exceeded the expectations of anyone. These are not students who were prepared, as I say, they weren't prepared for this in any specific way. And moreover, the other students who were told that they would be performing below average, in fact, also performed to those expectations. And there are implications for education, because clearly, way beyond any pedagogical devotion that you could have to a certain kind of curriculum or a certain kind of teaching style or anything like this, it's obvious that there's a huge piece of self-programming that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy even very early on, and even in highly controlled circumstances like those of a classroom. Students can't do whatever they want in that, right? So in the pair group types of psychic studies that I'm referring to, the random number generator was the primary instrument that was given to an experimental group and a control group. And the experimental group was told, this is one of many experiments, the experimental group was told, you are going to be able to predict and even control the number that this random number generator will be producing. So here, write down, this is one of the setups of the experiment, write down the number and then press the button, and the number will come out, and you'll see how similar it is. It may not be at first, but if you concentrate really well, you'll get better at it. And the control group, it was the opposite, which was clearly that there was, to be as expected, that every subject participating in that study would be looking at a random number whose actual emergence they had nothing personally to do with. Okay? So now we have a situation where we start counting the number of times that the control group, that is the group that actually was told that they could in fact control and predict the number that was going to come out, was actually right in predicting the number that subsequently came out through the random number generator. And it turns out that not by a huge difference, but by a statistically significant difference, which means way beyond chance, it turns out that the control group was in fact able to predict with a much higher rate of accuracy the number that was coming out of the random number generator in their case than the control group was able to do with theirs. So something is happening where, this is where it first begins, where clearly this external machine is somehow linked in some way. There's a causal or a correlative relationship of some sort between the outcome of a machine that I have no control over and apparently my state of mind. And on the basis of this very anomalous but interesting result, it turns out that 30 years worth of experiments were done. And this really gets us into the position of predicting the future, right? Like one of the experiments that was done was actually to say, there's going to be a series of numbers that's going to be generated. Tell me that number. And the people write down the series of numbers. And that number series wasn't actually generated until about a week later. Again, with the experimental group, there were statistically higher hit rates in guessing those numbers than with the control group. Now we're talking about a week later. All right? Now here's another one. How about going backwards in time, which is even wilder? So in another experiment, what was done was a series of numbers were written and put into, they were generated by a machine. And they were put into an envelope and nobody saw that number, that sequence. That sequence was not visually witnessed by anybody, okay? And some days later or a week later, right, you would have, and again, no one saw it, you would have subjects in an experimental group being told, there's a number sequence that was generated some time ago. You need to guess what that was, or perhaps you can change it in some way. That's what they were told, right? So then they're like, okay, I'm going to focus on this. And then turns out that once again, in a way that was statistically beyond just mere chance, the experimental group was able to generate numbers that were much closer to the sequence that had been hidden beforehand. So in this case, rather than going just forward, right, the process is working backwards as well. What is going on here? It makes you wonder about where we are with temporality, the idea that somehow there's a before and an after, and that everything in time always goes forward, and then this set of consequentially important preparations for a particularly meaningful or desirable end result after a certain period or interval of time it forms the basis of all of our realistic expectations about living in the world. Turns out that there are some strange footnotes to that would take exception to that as the only pattern of activity. So let's put it into a more relative way, right? It's true that if you and I took off from one source, one point of departure, and we're supposed to go to a specific destination, and there's something there that we need to go see. And if you went before I went, right, I would have the experience that you've had, but you would have it before I have had it, right? So there's a way in which you can think about that as a kind of localized time experience, where in fact it's often the case that when you're older, you've already gone through certain things that younger people haven't gone through. And it doesn't mean in any way that time isn't significant, but that it does have a very curious folding simultaneity to it when the older person who's experienced everything, sitting or standing next to the younger person who hasn't experienced very much, both are looking in the same three-dimensional space, but from the standpoint of experience, one has all of the results and the other one doesn't. So again, we have a kind of folding of time, because you can be sure that that young person is going to end up over there with the same experiences or very similar experiences, right? You can get two old people of any age and you can have them have a conversation from any part of the world, and they're going to be sharing many similar experiences that you wouldn't think they'd be sharing, just because of the nature of their being in different cultures and being geographically distant. So these are fascinating things. Put all of this into a context where then you think that there are considerations about your life that will not arrive before certain things have happened. That there are certain things you may be preparing for, or that you may be hoping and wishing and aspiring toward, even striving for. And there's a certain amount of time that will pass before those things come to you. But if what those experiments have, by way of showing us in some metaphorical, modeled way, is true, then you might be able to significantly shrink and maybe even have a kind of warp overlap with the amount of time that it takes you to get from here to there. What if you don't believe? What if you don't believe? Just like the self-programmed subjects in that random number generator experimental group. What if you don't believe that your life has to be in some way one that has these sequential steps which can never occur out of order, right? Then you exist in a way out of the conditions of causality and time. And if you take that to a certain end state, then you end up with a position in which you can be outside of many things. The degree to which you think, believe, concentrate, focus, commit, and practice this is going to produce for you greater and greater interaction effects against time, and you will be able to get there more quickly. For which reason, I think some of the religious texts like the Bhagavad Gita do tell, of Brahman saying, people abide in me, but I do not abide in them. You just think about that for a second, I just think that that's just such a great, thought, that there's this timeless being or force operating on your life, and you abide in it, but it doesn't abide in you. So that means that if you abide in something that doesn't abide in you, then there's also an off-ramp, a possibility to escape the strictures and constraints of the environment in which you and it exist. And there's a reason that the Godhead, Brahman, God, etc., is considered the universal force and the eternal and timeless being, because it is, shall we say, an intelligence, an organism, a force of some sort that exists beyond temporal sequence. It is like someone who took that experimental group and completely took it as far as it could go, and there's no sequentiality that conditions or limits its ability to do what it needs to do. Maybe that's what real human potential is. My friends, Francisco, Ricardo, let me just leave you with that. I can go into all of the theological, philosophical, ontological, and eschatological kinds of dimensions of this, but I take great comfort in knowing that time really is relative in some way that we do not understand. Causality, and that is cause and effect, as a result of the before and after, that is the phenomenon of time, is not as inflexible and all-controlling and abstractly universal as it may seem to be. There are many elements of this that now have empirically been proved to be a lot more relative than we would have thought. And without getting very Einsteinian and Heisenbergian and, uncertainty principle kinds of things, I will also say that physics supports some of these speculations, and they have also been observed at the quantum mechanics level. So, if you're stuck in your life, if you're stuck in a circumstance, perhaps the time that you feel or you experience as a kind of web on your life that has kind of held you there, and fate is like the spider that's coming over to suck you dry, is probably as much a mental construction as you're able to handle. I just can't believe that we can change causality or cause and effect in these temporal experiments, and then somehow it only works in the context of an experiment and not really in anything else. I don't believe that. Let's see what we can do. I think time is relative. Well, my friends, time to go and have my tea, and I will see you next time, and I wish you many blessings and many insights.